Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It's time for part 2 of the monthly Q&A for April. April Q&A 2021.
Is it April, is it?
Yeah, it's getting into the year, isn't it? It's gone quickly.
I lost track of what month we were in.
So
I have to take your word for it.
Yeah, I think I'm right on that one, but we'll check.
Could have just about told me anything.
I'll edit it out if I've gotten it wrong. But anyway, we've got more YouTube, Patreon, float plane questions to get to, so let's get into it. What do you think about the things concerning the RTX 3080 Ti launching in a few months? So obviously the rumor mill is starting to kick up a little bit more on the 3080 Ti. I think it's looking like a 12 gigabyte GPU. I think people have...
It's been all over the place. This thing.
I think it was 20 gig. Now
well, that's not to have got
the
rumors. Like, you know, I had it on good authority that it was going to be these things and it was going to be launching at certain times. Then Nvidia delayed it because of, demand reasons and things like that. What do we think about the things concerning?
I think this is mostly probably asking about, stuff like why would you bother launching it in this current climate? Because a lot of the rumors are suggesting, obviously it's not going to be as expensive as an RTX 3090 in terms of its MSRP, but then even if it's like $1,200, it's not going to be a $1,200 GPU, is it? So
no. In
terms of like AIBs are just going to come straight out the gate and price it at $2,000. So
yeah, I don't quite get the point, but there might be. I haven't really looked into it either, and it might be clearer once we get them.
Yeah, I guess while 3090s are still flying off the shelves and they could sell binned GPUs at 30... I guess the point is they're trying to, instead of selling you a binned 3090 that can't quite be a 3090 as a 3080 for $800 or $700, whatever it is, they'll try and sell it to you as a 3080 Ti, which is slightly less cut down and is priced a lot higher. So
yeah, I guess that's
I think
it.
But I would expect based on that and what we've seen from the 3080 that the 3080 Ti will also be very hard to find while 3090s are still flying off shelves, because it will only be binned models. We've seen that so many times before. 3060 Ti, the Ryzen 3 processors, 3300X. It's like if it's a binned part and the higher tier parts are flying off the shelves, there's just no incentive to make the cheaper part, so they won't.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see how much stock there is, but...
All right, with a recent GPU selling for ridiculous prices, will vendors and AIB keep pricing like this indefinitely, realizing people are willing to pay those prices? So my answer to that is definitely no. At the moment, there is only so much supply that's making it to the hands of gamers. Obviously, a large percentage or some percentage is going to places like miners. So it's really the most desperate of the desperates that are paying the top dollar for the cards. But once supply starts to meet demand or overwhelms demand, they'll then want to convert sales for people who aren't willing to pay stupid prices, and I believe that would be the majority of people. So they will have to be quite competitive on pricing once again. Whether they'll go down to as competitive as they were once upon a time, I don't know, but they'll be better than they are now.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this as well, the current prices are based on how profitable a certain GPU is for mining. So if a GPU can make, let's say, $300 a month mining, then a lot of the price is going to be based on, okay, well, you spend $2,000 on this, you're going to make your money back in 6 months or whatever it would be.
Yep.
So while mining remains as profitable as it is at the current rate, and it does get more difficult over time. Again, I'm not a mining expert, but I hear this, so it must be some truth to it.
Tim hears things.
Yeah, so that's going to keep prices at a certain level, but it's not going to keep them going up indefinitely, because they're not going to make a card cost more than it is profitable in mining, because that would be ridiculous. Miners would start buying them, the demand would fall off a cliff, and then you've just priced yourself out of the market entirely. So they're not going to keep rising indefinitely. And a lot of what you say is almost already happening in some ways, in that cards like a 6700 XT that we've talked about a few times before, it's not a great card for mining, so the demand from miners is not as high as it is for a 3080 or a 3090. And they're priced high, but in a lot of regions, they aren't selling a lot of them at those prices. So
that's right.
In Australia, you could walk into a lot of stores right now and buy one for, again, a high price, over $1,000 Australian dollars, when it should be more like a $700 or $800 GPU. But they're available if you want it at that price. So when it stabilizes at that price, generally you can't then raise the price, because you're just making the problem worse. So the direction for those cards if it keeps up in the current way that it is to go the other way. But then again, AMD's facing issues with brands. People still want GeForce for gaming, even though an AMD card might be better value. So yeah, there's a lot of things to happen there, but indefinitely raising is not going to happen. All right, next question is, do you think GPU prices are permanently ruined? In other words, do you expect Nvidia and AMD to just launch new flagship GPUs at $2,000 plus simply because this scalper market has told them that they can? It's going to be an interesting balancing act because...
I think this is a very similar question to one we've previously answered.
It is. Obviously, when we were talking previously about AIB pricing and all that, there is a limit on what they can sell it at. So that's one issue.
Yeah.
The second issue that they're facing is how much of a negative press and perception hit are they going to take by significantly raising prices from one generation to the next? Because they've gone from one generation where 2080 Ti is like $1,200. Now you can buy that sort of performance for $500. If they release the next gen card and 2080 Ti performance has gone back up to like $1,000, then that's going to be very negatively received by reviews and people in general, regardless of any stock situation. So even if stock is still horrible and selling out at $1,000, they're going to get all that negative attention towards themselves for doing it. So they put themselves in quite a difficult position where ideally they'd want to create even faster GPUs and price them even higher. So like a next generation faster than 3090 product is now $2,000 or whatever, and then price them all the other cards relative to that.
It's the only way they could do that. Yeah, they have to get a massive performance jump.
So yeah, you might see something where like a 3070 is either the same price for the next gen or slightly cheaper while they push it way up in the high end, like we saw with Turing. So I'd expect something like that to happen again. But yeah, because there's two companies both competing, if one company goes with one strategy and another company goes with the other strategy, then they could be in a bit of strife from a perception point. So yeah, it's interesting one to play out, but yeah, who knows?
It's been mentioned a few times that people should consider the capability of their displays before getting the latest and greatest GPUs. But would it be possible to get a GPU/monitor tier list for today's games? Where would you guys draw the line between good enough or really should be upgraded? That's an interesting one. Pretty difficult given how... Well, you'd have to very much generalize with the monitors, wouldn't you? Because there's just so many options.
Yeah, I mean, it always depends on your budget and that sort of thing. I think if you're talking about... You should really consider upgrading this as sort of the minimum of, drawing the line. Then if you're on a 1080p 60Hz monitor, I think it's fairly safe to say that it's time to upgrade that. Even if it's just a 1080p high refresh rate, you're getting a big upgrade. So that's kind of where I would... It's hard to draw the line any higher than that because it depends on sort of the budget that you have.
Well,
and
not even that. It depends on the gamer and what they prioritize.
Exactly.
Like, if you're playing... Again, you can argue all day that everyone should have a high refresh rate monitor because they're better, and it's like, I'm definitely more in that camp. But also you might play Tomb Raider, Assassin's Creed, and all those sort of games where you only aim for like 40 to 60 FPS anyway.
Then you should be getting a 1440p monitor.
I think so, yeah.
So I think 1080p 60 doesn't really serve very many...
It doesn't, but again, it's very budget. Like
it is.
Yeah.
It is, but if we're talking about, like, let's say you are a budget gamer...
Well, you're not upgrading to that from anything.
No, so I think... Yeah, if you had a whole bunch of stuff with your system and a 1080p 60Hz monitor was one part of it,
sure, that'd
and
be
you're
one
thinking,
of the first things.
okay, what do I upgrade? Your monitor would be one of the first things. Whereas I think if you had 1080p 144 Hz or 1440p doesn't need to be upgraded from. If you have 1440p high refresh, you're set for at least a long while. Whereas 1080p 144, it's again depends on the GPU you have. The higher end, the more likely or the more incentive you have. Whereas for GPUs, it's kind of like, well, what can you even buy?
It's very,
for instance, the same issues.
I think it's less of a guide thing. It's very individual.
Yeah,
like you sort of really know whether your monitor's holding you back or should be upgraded. Basically, it's like, do I need a higher refresh rate or do I need a higher resolution? Same
with GPUs. Like if you're playing a game and the latest title comes out and I was previously playing 60 FPS, but this new game is too
and you can
intensive.
no longer tweak the visual settings to a satisfactory level. Then
then it's probably time to start thinking about upgrade. But then that's going to differ if you're a higher end gamer. So it's very subjective sort of thing. Right, Steve, here we go. Here's one that you love talking about. Does the base clock have any practical meaning other than being used for calculating TDPs / being a throttling frequency on modern desktop CPUs? Does it have any impact on performance?
Well, it depends. I mean, what you've said there is pretty accurate. Like, it's the base clock, which the TDP in a way alludes to, is the minimum level of performance you can expect to receive from that CPU under whatever condition. If it's a small form factor PC and it's running an AVX 512 workload in the case of an 11th gen CPU, then it may drop down to that frequency, and whatever performance you will receive at that frequency is the minimum level of performance you will receive from that CPU. So that's pretty much what the base clock is for. Like, the only way the CPU would drop down below that base clock is if there's some kind of cooling or power delivery problem, some sort of failure there. But otherwise, it should drop down to that frequency, and that's as slow as it should go. So that's pretty much that, really. The TDP, again, it's like, I don't know. I don't really want to get into the whole TDP thing or discuss that, because we'll be sitting here till this time next week, and we probably won't have really achieved much. But the TDP is just, we've said it a million times, it's kind of a meaningless thing, because you can't even compare AMD and Intel TDPs because they're calculated in entirely different ways. And then certain CPUs have the same TDP, though they can be wildly different in terms of actual performance that you'll receive. And it's not really an indication of anything. It's not an indication of what kind of cooler you necessarily need to bring to the table. It's
just ignore the TDP.
I mean, that's really, it's the best thing you can do is ignore the TDP, because it's not helpful really in any way, is it? So, so the base clocks are about the same. Really, the clocks that Intel processors are a bit of a mess, really. The thing that's not published anymore is the clock multiplier table, and that's what the CPU will run at if there are no power limits, which is true for most of the motherboards you will buy. So, clock multiplier table, which without power limits, see something like the 11900K, it'll run at 4.8 gigahertz all core, and then you can go as high as 5.3 single, which for most tasks you're not going to see. It's more of a quick boost up for a second to open your Chrome tab or whatever. We have a hypothetical question. We love those here at Hardware Unboxed. If CPUs and GPUs were readily available at their MSRPs, I think that's too much. You shouldn't pose. Don't do that to people. How would you each build a modest budget gaming PC? So like $1,200 US. I'm curious to see if one of you would put more towards one component than the other, and how the overall balance of the builds would go.
All right, so what would you do?
Well, you were doing what you do, made a few notes because I read this question. Cool. Is that cheating?
It's cheating, yes.
Well, I'm going to cheat. So I went to Newegg and had a quick look, and I worked out. So I would, right now, I'd get the Intel Core i5-10400F because it's $180. Actually, I think... Yes, that's what I would go with. Yeah, the 10400F, because I think that's slightly cheaper than the 11400F.
Yep.
It was $180 at the moment, so I thought that was pretty good.
I
didn't check the 11400F, but if that's a similar price, maybe get that with a motherboard to suit. The reason I didn't go with the Ryzen 5 3600 is because it's $220 US, so that's like $40 more. And then the Ryzen 5 5600X is like $300 if you can find it. So I think the 10400F is probably the best value. What are we doing? Modest gaming PC CPU at the moment.
Yep. As
for cooler, feel free to do your own research because I certainly didn't. The Cooler Master Blizzard T400i looked like
cool name.
Well, Cooler Master make good value coolers, and this is $25 US. So 140mm fan, decent looking aluminium heatsink with some copper heat pipes and stuff like that. It's a 10400F. I'm pretty sure that will allow that CPU to run without power limits. MSI Z490A Pro, because I have tested that board, very good value board, currently $180 US and in stock, so that's good. Yep. 16 gigabytes of Crucial Ballistics DDR4 3600 CL16 memory, that's $95. You can save like $20 by getting like 3200 memory with lesser timings, but I think that's pretty good sweet spot memory. Team Group T-Force Cardia 0Z330 1TB hard drive or SSD, $100. So
good deal.
I think a 1TB's a good amount of storage for a modest PC because you're not having to uninstall games and all that. And of course, you can add a spinning disk later. I guarantee this one I'll get critiqued on this. So the EVGA Supernova 750G Plus power supply was $110. Not a power supply expert, but that looked like a pretty good power supply.
Oh, if it's not in that PSU tier list thing that I see from time to time, you're going to get wrecked.
Didn't check the PSU tier list, but this one looked okay on paper to me, so looking forward to getting wrecked. For the cases, again, highly subjective, but I think the Corsair 4000D Airflow, I was surprised when I saw that's $95. I built what did I build in that? I think it was the Z590 test system with it was the Aorus Master 11.
Nice.
Awesome case. $95. I think that's pretty good. I think it's good. And then that leaves us with enough budget for a Gigabyte GeForce RTX 3060 Ti, which is selling for $400. Isn't available, but of course we're talking about if it was available. That would come out to $1,185 US, leaving me with $15 left over, and I'd take Tim out for a cheap lunch.
Yeah, very cheap. We're going to Macca's on that one.
Well, it's 15 US.
15 US. Ooh.
It's like 100 Australian.
That's a pretty good build. The things I'd be wondering, I mean...
I should have made you go first, damn it.
Well, I would have made a build that's almost exactly the same. So first of all, I definitely would have said 10400F, but I was wondering, would an RTX 3060 or 3060 Ti fit in the budget?
Mm-hmm.
3060 Ti, you've managed to fit in there.
Squeeze that in there.
The one thing I'd be wondering is like, can we cheap out a bit on the motherboard and go like B560 and run a 10400F on it? Potentially that's one area that I'd be looking at.
Yeah, that's maybe a better way to go, or a different way for sure.
But it's like, does that get you an extra CPU tier or an extra GPU tier? Potentially it does. So that's probably what I'd be thinking of within that budget. And then, just the usual optimization of like cases and stuff. I always really cheap out on cases. So whatever $50 piece of crap's available is what I'd go for. And but I think that's, you're generally going to be looking at a 10400F like processor with an RTX 3060 like GPU. And if you can really penny pinch, then you might be able to push that up to a 3070 or a 6700 XT.
Yeah, you might be able to. I doubt it though.
I do doubt it as well. You might
basically, if you go with the 11400F, I think that's $20 more. Then you're looking at saving about $40 maybe on the motherboard. So you're $20 ahead. Then
you get a slightly better CPU, basically, is what you may be optimizing.
And then you get a crappier case, so you're just saving a slightly more money. But I think the Corsair 4000D is an awesome case, and really you could keep that for well over a decade.
Yeah,
like that is a really high quality case, plenty of expansion. The only reason you wouldn't buy that case is that it's a bit too big, maybe for your use case. But if size is an issue, that's a case you can see many, many, many builds through. So for $95, you're gonna get your money's worth out of that. And then, I went for the 3060 Ti because it's currently the cheapest current generation GPU, apart from the 3060. What's the 6700 XT? It's
480. Yeah, 480, 479. Yep.
Yep. So, no, I think the 3060 Ti, I believe, is winning on my cost per frame charts.
If only they existed.
If only they existed.
Yeah.
So, anyway, enjoy that lunch.
All right, next question. Why aren't the channels that are recommending CPUs based on the current availability and pricing also commenting on the price of motherboards? Intel CPUs look attractively priced right now, but the board pricing is horrible enough to offset that a lot. Now, I don't think this is necessarily true. Also, is this directed at us? Because we definitely talk about motherboard pricing in our content. We always factor in the motherboard because you can't plug the CPU into nothing. It needs a motherboard. I think this comes from, it's usually people saying, you have to compare B550 to Z590, but that's not true anymore. You should be comparing B550 to B560.
Yes, that's right. So, and even then, the Intel boards, they're more expensive, but as an example here, I've got the MSI Pro B550M VDH. You're laughing at the name of the boards.
They're horrible.
So it's $110 US. So that's the AMD B550 version of MSI's sort of entry-level but not terrible motherboard. And then the equivalent, which is the B560M Pro VDH Wi-Fi, is $140. So that's the Intel version. It's $30 more. However, the AMD board started at $130. So, again, what you're saying isn't factoring in boards getting cheaper over time, so that's fair. But basically, based on that, where we're comparing two very similar motherboards, the Intel board is $30 more. However, if we get to the CPUs, right now on Newegg, as I said before, the Ryzen 5 3600, $220. And then it looks like the Core i5 11400F and 10400F are both around $180 at the moment. So that makes Intel, what's that? That's like $40 cheaper on the CPUs, which makes them $10 less overall. And you might think, well, it's only $10 less. And that's right. And you could argue that their Ryzen platform does have a better upgrade path, which is true. You know, I'm not sure you'd stick a 16-core CPU on the cheap B550 board. You could, probably not for, you know, running Blender or whatever. The point is you can get like, you know, an 8-core and a 12-core CPU quite comfortably. You can get an 8-core with Intel as well, I suppose. But the 11400F was 13% faster than the Ryzen 5 3600 on average in our gaming benchmarks. So it is faster.
So it's cheaper and faster.
So it's $10 cheaper and it's faster. And when that was the case for when it was a case where the Ryzen 5 processor, the Ryzen 5 3600 was down around $160, it was around anywhere from $20 to $40 cheaper than the Intel part. And I think it being that much cheaper, plus the other perks of, you know, a better platform and all that sort of stuff, we basically said they're about the same, but we'd probably go with AMD for that upgrade path. But the fact that Intel's cheaper and faster, it's like, yeah.
I agree. Absolutely.
That's that one really. So yeah, don't agree with your question there. I don't think Intel CPUs are horrible in terms of pricing. They're not as good. But again, the B560 boards may drop by $20 over the next few months, and then you're splitting hairs.
With all the shortages and the miners and the scalpers and the greediness of consumer shops, do you think we are ever going to see another GPU at MSRP ever in the first month of launch? So are we always going to be in a situation where they release a card at the MSRP and then it's just massively inflated right away? Do
we ever see that with a good product?
And that's exactly what I was going to say.
Sorry.
It's a perfectly fair point, because this never happens.
No.
Never happens.
No,
You're
never.
Always looking at...
as far back as I can remember.
Yeah. The first month is usually terrible for availability, even the good times. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's all about, you know, does it come down in price within the first 4 to 8 weeks? That's generally where you want to see, you know, good supply of your entry-level cards, like, you know, your Gigabyte Eagles and your Tough Gamings and those sort of products. You want to make sure that they're not just 100% prioritizing high-end cards. And that should generally, based on most past launches, be within the first month, if not the month after.
There are a lot more PC gamers now, which is the only thing that would make historic data slightly invalid or misleading to apply now. Yeah. But, you know, if they ramp up supply and the manufacturers, they want to capture as many people as early on as they can, because that's when you're going to make the most sales, at least in one burst.
Yeah.
Because there's all the hype and excitement for the product.
It's going to be very interesting as well to see with future generations. There was a lot of interest in upgrading with this generation because of, you know, we'd really suffered through 3 or 4 years of pretty weak GPU upgrades in terms of Turing not really living up to what a typical GPU generation should have been. So there's a lot of people that were wanting to upgrade this generation. If everyone does successfully eventually upgrade at some point this generation, you know, is that going to cause less demand for the future generation? So that's a question that may see you more able to buy a next-gen GPU at the MSRP, because demand will be less. You know, if there's a mining crash, there might be a significant oversupply of used mining GPUs in the market, which would again affect future GPU launches, because people might have been able to buy a really cheap 3080 or 3070 or something to satisfy their needs. So, yeah, with every launch, there's going to be some questions, but I think, yeah, it's kind of the month after the initial launch that is the key month for seeing cards at MSRP. So we'll see.
Any speculation, so this has to be a Tim question, on whether resizable bar might come to Turing? It seems it might be a nice gesture of goodwill for those who jumped into RTX early. Nvidia and their gestures of goodwill.
Won't happen. No, Nvidia won't do it. No way.
I'm not as sure. I mean,
it requires a VBIOS update. Do you reckon they can be bothered doing that for cards that were released 3 years ago? I don't know. Probably not.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Based on Nvidia, it's not Nvidia.
If I had to bet, I'd say you're right.
If it was a driver software feature like Broadcast,
yeah,
where they just release a driver update and it just uses the shaders or whatever, then I'd be more inclined to say that this could happen where we get ReBAR and Turing. But because it requires the BIOS update, the VBIOS update side of things, I don't think they'll invest the energy into updating it.
Yeah, and typically if they can use a feature to leverage, buys in future sort of sales. So if it's a feature that, you can get moving forward, they will do that. They won't go back and add it to previous generation. Yep. Because at the moment, resizable bar, especially from what we've seen on Nvidia's side, it's not huge. Like, the typical games where we've seen it work well with AMD, like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, those sort of games, there's a nice performance boost there. But for a lot of games, it does nothing at all. So for the most part, it's not even worth updating your VBIOS and risking bricking your graphics card to get resizable bar support. But for future games, it could be of quite a large benefit, like what we're seeing in Assassin's Creed, or even potentially better. So you could be looking at anywhere from 10-20% performance uplift, and that's when you're going to want it. So it'll be an incentive to buy a new product just to get that feature. Obviously, getting a new product with more performance anyway, but it's just it just adds to it. All right, question for Tim. Tim,
I'm ready.
Based on your experience, your limited experience, how often... No, they didn't say that. How often do monitor manufacturers release firmware updates that add features or more options in the settings?
I wouldn't say it never happens. I'd say that, there's a good half, if not more, of monitors that cannot be updated. Like, there's no mechanism for a user to upgrade the firmware because there's either no USB ports, or there's USB ports, but they're not actually connected. They're just used for a hub or something like that. So there's a lot of monitors.
I think that's an oversight, especially for really high monitors. We have seen instances, correct me if I'm wrong, where certain brands have released a product that actually had a flaw that could be solved through a software update.
Yeah, so like the Samsung Odyssey line, for example, has had flickering issues, which was solved through a firmware update, or I'm not sure whether it was 100% solved, but significantly improved through a firmware update maybe 3 months after launch. So that's one example where, it really, as you say, should be a feature for higher monitors, or really all monitors, especially if they could.
You can justify, though, when you're spending huge amounts of money on a really premium product, that it has some easy way to update, because it can save the manufacturer a huge amount of lost investment and recalls and stuff like that. If there's a way for you to download the fix, plug it in, and there's a really smart system like what we see for updating VBIOSes or even motherboard BIOSes.
It's usually very easy. You just go into the thing, click firm update, and it goes.
It's very easy if they lay out the groundwork for it to be very easy.
Yeah, because otherwise they'd have to take either release a revision of the same monitor, because they can update monitors in the factory using the internal tools.
Yeah,
but I mean that's requires a revision of the hardware, so that's never good. I have seen occasionally features get added, not just fixes for broken things. I have an LG 27 GN950, so the 4K 144Hz monitor.
Yes. A
firmware update enabled 160Hz operation on that monitor.
Okay.
So it also fixed the sRGB mode, which I highlighted in the review was broken. So they fixed that, but then they also added 160Hz. So there is an incentive there to upgrade the monitors. For that one, I think you had to download a utility on Windows, and it sends it over the USB cable into the monitor, but it worked.
That's pretty clever. Yeah.
So yeah, it's... Most monitors are feature complete from the factory, but it's not. It does happen from time to time. I've seen it. So,
can happen. Potentially, you'd like to see more of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's some monitors where it'd be good, if I say that, for example, there's no sRGB emulation mode, which is really handy to stop oversaturation. Let's say the MSI monitor that we've been recommending a fair bit, which has a name I don't want to say because it's horrible. But that monitor doesn't have an sRGB emulation mode, so it'd be good if you could update it and have that feature added in. That would improve that product. So,
see, fix your monitor names, MSI, and everyone else who makes monitors. Well, just about everyone else who makes monitors. Because then Tim will say the name and people will know the monitor he's talking about, and maybe that'll result in some extra sales.
Yeah.
I mean, make your products easy to remember and say, so people can recommend your products. Is that like a marketing 101?
Yeah, it is.
Seriously. It's like, what is it? The Samsung, they're C, add a number.
Yeah, easy. Okay, Steve, there's a trend of heatsinkless VRMs on newer budget Intel motherboards. Would it be worth testing/investigating the effects of an aftermarket heatsink and see if performance is improved for something like the i5 11400F?
Well, first of all, I don't know if it's just entry-level Intel motherboards. I think they do it, the board partners do it for all of their most entry-level boards, or some of them do it.
Yep.
Typically in the past, I've just recommended that's an instant don't buy, just move to the next one till they can bother putting a heatsink on it, because it's probably not going to be a very good motherboard, especially because most of them cost anywhere from $50 to $70. So not the kind of motherboards you guys will be wanting to purchase. Putting a heatsink on it, if you can get one that, will go in the mounting holes and that sort of stuff, it's bound to help. But the VRM itself, you probably uses really crap components that, it's not going to... I mean, those boards are designed to work with like a 10400F or 11400F anyway. It's more if you want to maybe run them without any power limits or put a higher end processor in there. So your upgrade path is very limited, which is why I don't recommend them, because often they'll be like $70, and then for $90 to $100, you can get a board with a significantly better VRM, heatsinks on it, all that sort of stuff.
And how much are you spending on the heatsinks? If it's like you're spending $10 or $15 on heatsinks,
maybe,
then,
who knows? But the point is, you spend $10 or $20 or $30 more, and you just get a significantly better product that you'll be able to keep for much longer, or have the potential for putting more higher end CPUs on. I'm not sure if those boards are limited to a certain TDP type processor, like where they're 65 watt boards and the 125 watt CPUs aren't supported. I have seen a bit of that in the past with on AMD's side when they started doing, I think it was the Ryzen 7 for the first generation, or at least the higher wattage 95 watt parts or whatever. But yeah, look, you can put a heatsink on them. It's certainly going to make them run a bit cooler. Whether it's enough to be able to, run higher end CPUs or higher power limits, don't know. Well, don't know. I'm not wanting to dismiss your question, but I'm also not super interested in buying those crap boards to do it, because I just recommend you don't buy them. I don't think the saving is justified there. Why is there no middle ground between 1440p and 4K? It seems like a huge step up in GPU firepower. However, there's no game/monitor resolution like 1700 or 1800p to smoothen the transition.
Well, in games, you can run at those resolutions via 4K, resolutions scalers, or going into Nvidia's control panel, AMD's control panel, setting a custom resolution for your monitor. That's always an option that you can do. So again, that is an option. Why isn't there a monitor with a resolution like that is a much harder to answer question, because you would think that the market for something like an 1800p monitor might be there. But then you sort of think, okay, well, how would that fit into the pricing structure of current monitors? Like, if you're already having to spend $500 on, let's say, a really good quality 1440p monitor, and then a 4K monitor is costing you $700 for the same sort of refresh rate and quality, then would there really be enough interest in a $600 1800p monitor that does something very similar? You kind of, in those situations, would go one or the other way. Like, if you're a high-end buyer, you'd have the money to afford the 4K monitor and all the hardware necessary. Whereas if you're more of a mid-range buyer, then you would just go all the other way and get the more budget option. Yeah,
because I imagine like production lines, then you need to dedicate a certain percentage to making this other panel type. And
it wouldn't work well with. I mean, 1440p isn't great for running like videos at native resolution, because videos are generally either 1080p or 4K. So that would be another issue as well. It's like, again, you're kind of like 80% of 4K. It's how well does that work with those sorts of things? So there's a whole bunch of reasons why they probably wouldn't do that. But 4K, and then buying a 4K monitor and then downscaling to 1800p is generally pretty good. We're using DLSS, which does downscaling as well. So
I personally wouldn't buy that sort of weird in-between thing, and I think most people wouldn't. You'd go sort of one or the other and do what Tim's suggesting. It's kind of like, with a situation where Intel was offering, what was it at one point on their high-end desktop platform? It was like, I think they went as low as 4, but let's say 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 core CPUs. And it's like, do I get the 12 or do I get the 14? And then if I get the 14, like, it just became too confusing. It's like, which one do you buy? So I think giving people two very distinct options, it's like 4K or 1440p. It's pretty obvious. And then you work out all the refreshes and panel types and all that stuff, because there's so many other things to consider. I think it's become too confusing, sort of overwhelming if it's not already.
All right, and that does it for part 1 and 2 of the Q&A. So
We made it.
a lot of stuff happening, but yeah, we'll take a pause there. There's more questions coming up in part 3. As usual, it might be a couple of days away for that video. If you've reached the end of part 2 and for some reason you didn't watch part 1, which would be very strange, you can go back and watch part 1. It's on the main channel as well. We also have our Patreon and Floatplane accounts if you're interested in signing up. Get access to our wonderful Discord community, behind the scenes videos, monthly live streams, a bunch of other stuff as well. So it's always a good time to support the channel in that way and get some nice bonuses on the side. So yeah, anything else at the end of this one?
I think you've covered it all. You've nothing else to add there. Just thanks for watching. Appreciate the support. And I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.